Hello everyone and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. In part 1 of my favorite books of all time, I covered 5 honorable mentions and the first 12 titles of my top 22. For those of you that haven't seen this video, a brief reminder of what I'm doing here. On this channel I document my journey into fantasy, which I started this January. Before that, I read a lot of books in other genres. Most books that I read during the last, say, 45 years belong to literature. In later years, I started reading science fiction, thrillers, and mystery, and I've read some fantasy, not very much. With only about 30 fantasy books read so far this year, it's obvious I cannot yet make any kind of list in this genre. So this list concerns all the books I read prior to January of this year. In this video, I reveal my top 10 across all genres and subgenres. Every book deserves a full-length review, but that would not really fit on a channel that wants to focus on fantasy. So each of these titles will get a small review here and now. That's the least they deserve. But before I begin, I want to mention a couple of authors that didn't make it onto this list, even though they are favorites of mine. If I would have made a top 100, these authors most assuredly would have taken 1 or 2 spots. They are Isaac Bashevis Singer. He was a Jewish writer and Nobel Prize winner whose novels I've all read and without exception enjoyed thoroughly. Chaim Potok, also a Jewish writer, whose works I adore. Paul Auster, a very skilled surrealistic novelist who is also Jewish. And of course J.R.R. Tolkien has to be mentioned. He's one of the few fantasy writers I've read before this year. And then lastly I want to mention James Rollins, a thriller writer. I enjoyed every book in his Sigma Force series. Alright, now let's move on to my top 10. Coming in at number 10 is Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. I read this book back in 2011 and it was one of the first Heinleins I read. Within the next 5 years, I read almost his entire body of works. Heinlein was a very prolific writer. I think I've read about 50 of his titles by now. Stranger in a Strange Land was first published in 1961. The story is about Valentine Michael Smith, who, as the first and only human, grew up on Mars. When coming to Earth, he literally is a stranger in a strange land. Many ways of thinking and feeling distinguish him from other humans. For one, he has learned to use his brain capacity to the fullest, which gives him the ability, among others, to slow down his heartbeat and stop his breathing. His favorite hiding place is at the bottom of the swimming pool, where he can meditate for hours. Early on in the story, Michael sort of gets adopted by Jubal Harshaw, and he is one of my most favorite characters of all time. Jubal is an elderly writer, lawyer, philosopher, and much more. In the end, Michael decides to become a priest, not to preach a religion, but to merge the good of Mars with the good of Earth. The Martian way of life can only be represented in the Martian language, so his followers learn that language. When they grok something, they feel the uniqueness of the many Martian concepts. For instance, the Martians are unaware of the concept of haste. This Heinlein describes in his inimitable, sharp and humorous way as follows. It is later than you think could not be expressed in Martian, nor could haste make waste, though for a different reason. The first notion was inconceivable, while the latter was an unexpressed Martian basic, as unnecessary as telling a fish to bathe. Viewing and experiencing our world through the eyes of a born and bred Martian makes the reader think twice or thrice about our own habits and beliefs. Martians don't know jealousy, partly because they don't have any possessions. On Mars, there is no polarity between men and women, and death is something Martians welcome. They look forward to their discorporation, so something like murder is non-existent on Mars. Even though this book is outdated in some ways, the story still captivated me in 2011 because it shows some universal beauties in the field of free thinking. For example, one of those beautiful thoughts is that everything you do is inspired by God. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. So there is no such thing as sin. The Martian concept of God is quite refreshing. Everything that is good holds God inside. Or, in the words of Michael Smith, "Thou art God, I am God, the happy grasses are God, all shaping and making and creating together." Michael returns to Earth as a Messiah. There he delivers his message of acceptance of and trust in literally everything and everyone. This appeals to me greatly. Of course, this kind of utopian wishful thinking still hasn't become reality in our time. But hey, this is fiction. And in fiction, even the most unthinkable is possible. Coming in at number 9 is The Ghost Rider by Neil Peart. This book is very, very dear to me, even though it holds only spot number 9 in my top 10. Neil Peart is best known as the drummer and lyricist of the Canadian progressive rock band Rush. But he was also an accomplished writer. In Ghost Rider he relates the years following a personal tragedy. In August 1997, Neil and his wife Jackie received the news that their only child, daughter Selena, had died in a car accident. This shattered their world. In Jackie's case, the devastation was beyond repair. She had fallen to pieces and she never came back together again. If she couldn't have Selena, she no longer wanted anything. She wanted to die. Neil rapidly built a wall against things which were too painful for him to deal with. Within 5 months of Selena's passing, Jackie was diagnosed with terminal cancer. After her death, Neil remains alone, beaten. I didn't really have a reason to carry on. I had no interest in life, work, or the world beyond. On August 20, 1 year and 10 days after the death of Selena, he drives off on his motorcycle. Just kept moving, afraid to stop for too long, afraid to give myself time to think. His goal is not to get anywhere, but the task he has set himself is to nurture what he calls my little baby soul as well as he could. Earlier that summer, contemplating the wreckage of my life, I determined that my mission now was to protect a certain essence inside me, a sputtering life force, a great spirit, as though I held my cupped hand around a guttering candle. The whole idea is that time should be able to do its work as a healer, but for that, time must go on, and preferably as painlessly as possible. This next passage illustrates to me beautifully how Peart has no choice but to hit rock bottom before being able to find his way back up. Without knowing it, I'd identified a subtle but important part of the healing process. There would be no peace for me, no life for me, until I learned to forgive life for what it had done to me, forgive others for still being alive, and eventually forgive myself for being alive. In a letter to a friend, Peart writes that some people, mostly strangers, who met him in his capacity as a free-spirited biker, said they envied his freedom. This is way more freedom than anyone should ever desire, and carries way more baggage than freedom can ever sustain. This is more like desperate flight, and another name I have for myself is the Ghost Rider. I'm a ghost. I carry a few ghosts with me, and I'm riding through a world that isn't quite real. But I'm okay as long as I keep moving. Peart keeps on riding until after Christmas. He'd been on the road for 4 months and 1 week, during which he covered more than 46,000 kilometers. He spends the winter in his lake house above Montreal. There he goes outside daily for a long walk on his snowshoes or cross-country skiing. In a letter, he writes that according to all grief books he read, he must now be in the phase of acceptance. Acceptance seems to be where I'm at now. For when I first came into this house and looked around at the photos of Jackie and Selena, the words came into my head were, I know. That's all. Not that I can really accept it or necessarily live with it, but at least I know. But the healing road still hasn't yet brought enough healing. His little baby soul has to be on its way again. On April 21st, 1999, he hits the road again. After another 15,000 miles, Peart spends the summer back at his lake house. A life purpose, let alone meaning in life, has not yet returned. On August 29, 1999, he leaves again. Traveling was obviously still the best thing for me, and I decided I would try to stay out until Christmas again. I don't want to spoil the ending of this book, but after more than 88,000 kilometers, Peart finds that his gist for life has rekindled. He went back into the studio with Rush and recorded the Vapor Trails album. This album starts off with some exuberant and impressive bars on his drum kit, as if he wants to say, I'm back. Nowhere is this book nagging, self-pitying or gloomy. Peart does not shy away from describing his tears and melancholy, but they do not predominate. I'm deeply impressed by the writing skills of this drummer, who passed away in January of 2020. In sometimes poetic and at other times everyday language, he sketches a razor-sharp portrait of himself during this period of purification. In addition, he is honest and shows profound wisdom. Yes, Ghost Rider is a gem that I cherish. Then, coming in at number 8 is a book that I've mentioned a couple of times on this channel already, and that is Duncton Wood by William Horwood. I've got 3 copies of this. This is the American edition with the most ugly cover you can imagine, unfortunately. I've got my old Dutch edition, which was the first edition I read. And I have this beautiful leather-bound edition that I purchased rather recently. So, Duncton Wood. Number 8. When I was 17 years old, I hesitantly took my first steps into the world of adult books. One of my very first experiences was with Duncton Wood by William Horwood. He led me into a world of moles who, equipped with human qualities, worry about things like religion, freedom, love, violence, silence, literature, pretense, friendship, and so on. The young mole Bracken and his beloved Rebecca fight against the power-hungry Mandrake. The freedom of the mole community in the woods of Duncton is at stake, but Bracken manages to drive this antagonist away. For the first time, I was confronted with mystical matters, which I did not immediately know what to do with. The moles worship the stone, to which they direct all their prayers and in which they trust. This form of belief comes closest to Buddhism. As a symbol of their worship, the moles use the most lifeless and immobile of all symbols you could think of. But ultimately it's about faith itself, and that faith can only flourish if there is faith in oneself. The end of this novel, which I won't go into here, is overwhelmingly sad, beautiful, profound, but above all, hopeful. After reading Duncton Wood, it didn't take me very long to read such books as Watership Down and Shardik by Richard Adams, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea Trilogy, Roger Zelazny's Amber Cycle, and The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever by Stephen R. Donaldson. Hallwood's book is most similar to Adam's rabbit story, but Watership Down digs considerably less deep than Duncton Wood. The rabbits must create a chance to survive as a colony. The chases, the different strategies to free Pierce from captivity, and the plots against the enemies frame this urge for survival. Where Adams tells a single quest, Hallwood's novel unravels a threefold quest: the journey across the land, the journey in the mind, and the journey towards the end of life. This book is an exhilarating read that in the day kept me up into the late hours of the night. It's the first of two trilogies that are equally superb. Most of Hallwood's books are out of print, which is completely unjust. So from this small platform, a loud shout out for this masterpiece. For my number 7 spot, I'm going to cheat a little bit. Instead of one book, I'll list 3 books here by the same author, Raynor Winn. These are the books. Not long before the first book, The Salt Path, was published in 2017, I read the famous book by Paulo Coelho, The Pilgrimage. I found that to be a rich book. However, I missed the earthliness, that slight touch of humor at least. That book is all and foremost about learning, searching, understanding, etc. This pilgrimage Raynor Winn writes about is completely different. It's honest, open, cynical, humoristic, but above all it's beautiful. The writer never teaches the reader anything. If one chooses to learn anything at all, it's at their own command. Circumstances, more or less, force Raynor Winn and her husband, Moth, to start out on this crazy long-distance walk. Not only did they lose their home and livelihood, but on top of that, Moth is diagnosed with CBD, cortobasal degeneration, a rare brain disease with a grim outcome. Usually, people with CBD get to live about 6 years, and Moth has been having symptoms for about 6 years already. Raynor, or Ray, won't accept the facts. You can't be ill. I still love you. When they're already well underway on their southwest coast path, Moth asks Ray if they have any plan. Of course we do. We walk until we stop walking, and maybe on the way we find some kind of future. That's a good plan. Some sort of tax refund assures Ray and Moth of a weekly deposit of £48. That is all they have to spend during this trial. The Salt Path gives a naked view into the existence of homeless people. Apparent coincidental encounters occur frequently. For instance, they pass a man on a field seemingly performing some sort of yoga exercises. A bit further, they take a rest at a small churchyard. For the first time, a peacefulness comes over Ray. It was profoundly spiritual, nothing to do with God or religion, but a deeply human spirituality. Something of the knot I'd been carrying started to loosen. Maybe there was some power here. I cupped my hands and threw some air at Moth, just in case. The yoga guy passes and says he knew they'd passed him earlier on. Not that he had seen them. He's blind. When Ray starts explaining him the origins of their pilgrimage, he interrupts her. You are, and you'll travel many miles. Well, 250 to lands you'll see many things, amazing things, and suffer many setbacks, problems you'll think you can't overcome. He reached forward and put his hand on Moth. But you will overcome them. You'll survive, and it will make you strong. Their hunger reaches an all-time low when all the food is eaten and the next deposit is due another day. Moth found a hairy wine gum in his pocket, so we cut that in half. One of the highlights in the Salt Path is the encounter with the servers. When Moth and Ray tell them their story, one of them says, You're like a wave, man. How good a wave is depends on what nature's doing. It starts to pick up when the wind blows on the water, way out at sea. Then it's all down to how strong that wind is, how long it blows for, and how far it travels across the water. We call that the fetch. A big wind, a long fetch, a good stretch of coastline, and you've got it. You're barreling. But you're blown up by a fucking gale, man, and your fetch is still running. You're heading for the biggest, cleanest barreling wave, man. Contrary to predictions and warnings by doctors, Moth's health improves. Near the end of their path, someone offers them blackberries he's just picked. Moth and Ray had been eating them from the bushes, but they tasted sour and pungent. These berries, however, tasted soft, sweet, rich, and with a slightly salty note at the end. Unique. The man explains. You need to wait until the last moment, that moment between perfect and spoiled. Then you have something that money can't buy and chefs can't create. You can't make them. It has to come with time and nature. Eventually the cold forces them to stop their march. When they arrive in Polruan in October, an old man points out a peregrine. She's been here for a few weeks. Beautiful, ain't she? Not been here before, she haven't. No, she's new. Have you seen her before? I haven't. Moth and Ray can stay at a small cottage from a friend during the winter and early spring. Ray gets a temporary job as a sheep shearer. In spring they start out to walk the remaining 250 miles of the southwest coast path, in the opposite direction, starting at the end toward Polruan where they stopped last time. Again, after having walked for some time, Moth regains his old strength again. It is not some kind of miraculous recovery, but his revival is remarkable, to say the least. Arriving in Polruan, they see the peregrine again. The old man already walks towards them. She's been back a week now. She'd gone same day you were last year. Knew you were coming, that she were bringing you back. It's a sign, innit? Such a beautiful and valuable book. Raynor Winn's second book, The Wild Silence, is in some respect the same book as The Salt Path, but at the same time it's completely different. It features the same high-quality language, style, and almost careless symbolism that Winn has in her arsenal. The story, however, is less pressing, less urgent. This book is about finding direction in their completely new life. After walking the southwest coast path, they live in a small apartment in Polruan. Raynor can't sleep, and often she goes outside in the night into the fresh air. In a space between worlds, at a time between years, in a life between lives. I'm lost, but here, at least for a moment, I'm found. Her mother is dying, and Ray must decide to stop all the machinery that's keeping her alive. All the while, Moth's threatening disease is never far away. Ray does everything to walk away from that truth. His memory is failing him, and Ray decides to write down their adventures on the southwest coast path. At his birthday, she gives him the finished manuscript. When their daughter reads her story, she urges Ray to send it to the publishers. After receiving the message that Penguin is willing to publish a book, she writes these sensitive words. 1,000 swallows lifted into the warm wind, into autumn sunlight, reflected from outstretched wings the color of midnight skies. As the air cooled and the number of insects lessened, the birds simply faced south and let go of the land, disappeared into the white light of distance, beyond hope or faith. Instinct is our word, not theirs. They simply spread their wings and trust the air. Winn's language is very well taken care of. It's almost poetic. I underlined many beautiful sentences. The Wild Silence is a monumental book, which I enjoyed very much. For now, this is enough said about her mastery as a writer. I reviewed her third book, Landlines, in my video The Best Book of 2022. And thankfully, a fourth book is in the making. If you haven't read anything by Raynor Winn, check her out. It will most certainly be worth your while. And if you want to see the video I did on Landlines, check in the description down below for a link. Alright, number 6 in my top 10 of best books all time is another Dutch book. This is Winterlicht by Jeroen Brouwers. This is the only Dutch book on this list that hasn't been translated into English. But my top 10 would not be complete without one of the books of Jeroen Brouwers, my all-time favorite Dutch author. Internationally, he never received great recognition, although his book, Sunken Red, did rather nicely. But to me, he represents the highest attainable in writing. He's an impeccable stylist, and his language is one of the most well-nurtured I've ever read from any other Dutch author. This novel changed my entire perspective as a writer myself. When I was 20 years of age, I'd already written 2 novels. Thankfully, none of these were ever published. I was well underway in number 3 when I read Winterlicht, which would translate as The Light of Winter. I was struck by lightning. Instantly I knew that what I up until then had believed to be good writing was in fact not good writing at all. I abandoned my novel, and it took me many years of reading and practicing my skill before I tried my hand at another novel. For that, I'm still indebted to Jeroen Brouwers. This novel, in short, is about how transitory life and writing in truth is. It describes the relationship between an older author and his publisher. Late in life, Jacob Voorland, his name would translate as Jacob Fate, Jacob Voorland gets published by the narrator, the publisher. By that time, Voorland had written and published many books, every time by a different publisher, and never with any amount of success. The story depicts the last years of the angry, disappointed, and pathetic Voorland. The whole novel breathes compassion for the forgotten writer. One scene is typical of the mastership of Brouwers. Here, the old writer pulls an old suitcase from under the bed. It holds his entire body of works. One by one, he takes out his books that are all out of print and completely forgotten, and throws them demonstratively onto the bed. Every book which he had held up for me, whether commented on or not, the existing and yet non-existent author then threw on the bed until it was completely covered with his collected works. It seemed to me that at last there lay a dying body in death position. A true masterpiece. Too much time. Number 5 is Fateless by Imre Kertész, Nobel Prize winner as well. In Dutch it is called Onbepaald door het lot, just so you know. After reading this book, I cried for about 10 minutes. This was caused by the beauty and the mind-boggling great suffering to which the main character simply has to give meaning to. The book is an almost emotionless description of his year in the concentration camp of the Nazis. In the beginning, the lack of emotion bothered me. But in the last chapter, the main character describes his homecoming and his conversations with the journalist and 2 of his neighbors. The journalist urges him to make his experiences known to the world, while his neighbors advise to forget everything and start his life anew. They don't understand his argument that he doesn't want to forget, even assuming that he could, and that he must continue his life as it is, or die after all. This last chapter offers me a completely new way of looking at how survivors deal with the Holocaust. The main character makes a unique existentialistic effort. He cannot possibly believe that fate directed him into his experience. Every shred of belief in fate would mean that there is no freedom. So he strongly believes in free will and in making his own choices, even when these choices led him to the horrors of the Nazi camps. It was his choice that day of his arrest that he stood at the bus stop where the Germans seized him. It was his choice to aggravate one of the camp brutes. So, in a way, he chose to be beaten almost to death. For the author, who suffered in the camps himself, this is the only way to be able to face his own memories. The realization of the immensity of suffering that can make people take such an extreme view on things is what made me cry. That is exactly one of the reasons why his memories are written down in such a matter-of-fact way. They go beyond any possible understanding of what this suffering truly meant. One quote: "If you hadn't been gradually confronted with reality, but had been overwhelmed by all that knowledge immediately upon arrival, your brain and heart probably wouldn't have tolerated it." Any book that can provoke such a strong emotional response deserves praise. Imre Kertész's Nobel Prize was a rightful recognition of his mastery as a writer. Number 4 is Conversations with God by Neale Donald Walsch. I would like to include all 4 books with this title, but then my review would take up way too much of your time and mine. So I'll restrict myself to the first book in this series, Conversations with God, Book 1. In the spring of 1992, Neale Donald Walsch was at an all-time low point in his life. Angrily, he wrote a letter to God, asking him questions. When he was done, he wanted to lay down his pen, but his hand holding it kept hovering above the paper, as if held by some invisible force. Abruptly, the pen began moving on its own. According to Walsch, that is the moment when God himself started to directly communicate with him, although it remains to be seen if God is a he. Whether it's truly God speaking through Walsch's pen or not is irrelevant. In one of the books, Walsch asks who is actually writing the answers to his questions, upon which God replies, "You are." What is relevant is what this supposed God is saying. And all that is liberating in every sense of the word. Words, by the way, are very limited in expressing the profound messages God is trying to convey. My most common form of communication is through feeling. Feeling is the language of the soul. I also communicate with thought. In addition to feelings and thoughts, I also use the vehicle of experience as a grand communicator. Words are really the least effective communicator. Now, the supreme irony here is that you have all placed so much importance on the Word of God and so little on the experience. The open-minded reader gets several sneak peeks into the workings of creation, and those are, without exception, completely different from what religions have taught us. For example, if you believe that God is the creator and decider of all things in your life, you are mistaken. God is the observer, not the creator. You are living your life the way you are living your life, and I have no preference in the matter. I do not care what you do, and that is hard for you to hear. The richness of this book cannot possibly be illustrated in this short review, but let me at least try to explain what, according to God, our purpose is in life, although the word purpose is used nowhere by God. That purpose is to experience the full glory of who you really are. Let me attempt to clarify this, even though words are insufficient and our human comprehension of these matters is limited. So please bear with me for a second. God explains how in the beginning all that is could only grasp its own greatness as a concept, but not experience it. Still, all that is wanted to experience itself. That was not possible because even the concept of greatness remains relative. All that is could not know what it felt like to be magnificent unless that which is not showed up. In the absence of that which is not, that which is not. The one thing that all that is knew is there was nothing else. And so it could and would never know itself from a reference point outside of itself. Are you still with me? God explains that all that is then divided itself into that which is this and that which is that. Sounds simple, doesn't it? For the first time, this and that existed, quite apart from each other. It is the nothing which holds the everything. It is the non-space which holds the space. It is the all which holds the parts. By creating the here and there, the existent and the non-existent, this and that, God made it possible to know him or herself. Relativity or duality was the greatest gift God had made. Before, light couldn't be experienced, because that can only happen if its counterpart, darkness, exists. Light without context remains meaningless. The creation of opposites made experience possible. My divine purpose in dividing me was to create sufficient parts of me so that I could know myself experientially. My purpose in creating you, my spiritual offspring, was for me to know myself as God. Thus it can be said, and has been many times, that my purpose for you is that you should know yourself as me. Walsh, or God, takes this reasoning a few steps further, but I'll leave it at this, or that, whichever you prefer. This kind of in-depth thinking is something I've not found in any other book. Some passages took 3 or 4 times reading before I got the gist of it. But this whole concept of contrast in order to have any kind of experience or emotion literally changed my perception of life. A thing cannot exist without its opposite, except in the world of the absolute. In the absoluteness, there is no experience, only knowing. There is much, much more in these books that blew my mind, but this will have to do for now. People who are not trapped in dogmas should read these books by Walsh. He himself is absolutely convinced that God speaks through him, which is fine. I honestly don't really care, because whoever wrote these profound books speaks true to me. Reading these books were to me as a loud bang on a huge gong that still resonates inside of me and keeps on resonating. So we finally arrived at the top 3 of my all-time favorites, and on number 3 is a Murakami, the best Murakami I've ever read. I've read all of his books that were translated into Dutch, but this remains my favorite. Kafka on the Shore, or Kafka op het strand, as it sounds in Dutch. You see, it's quite a chunky book. It is almost 650 pages. This novel tells several stories that at first sight seem totally unrelated. The 15-year-old Kafka Tamura runs away from home. His father has cursed his son. One day you'll murder your father with your own hands. One day you'll lie down with your mother. A true Oedipus. His mother left the family when he was very young, taking away his sister. Kafka cannot even remember his mother. The young boy sets out on a quest to find his mother and sister. A second story revolves around Nakata. He's an older man who talks about himself in third person. As a kid, Nakata experienced an unexplained incident where all children of his school class, during a field trip through the woods, passed out. They all regained consciousness fairly quickly, except Nakata. After weeks in a coma, he finally awoke, having lost his intelligence altogether. From the best student in the class, he had spiraled into an extremely low IQ. His head was empty, literally. He had returned to the world as the proverbial tabula rasa. Nowadays, Nakata can talk with cats, which is possible in the universe of Murakami. The lives of other characters are narrated, and there's a lot of development going on within the storyline of Kafka and Nakata. A strongly surrealistic event prompts Nakata to go on a journey. He doesn't know where he has to go, but just that he has to go. In a believable and very well-crafted turn of events, all the different stories come together. And if the prophecy of Kafka's father will come true, I will not disclose here. At its core, this book touches upon the great questions of life. For me, the deepest meaning that the writer has put into this book is the question whether you as a human being want to remember your whole life or would rather forget everything. Memories make you feel warmer inside, but at the same time they also tear you to pieces from the inside out. This choice was made for Nakata, but Kafka has to choose on his own volition. This book, again, is an absolute masterpiece. It's a perfect composition with truly profound plot twists. It's obvious that I highly recommend this book. If you're still with me at this moment, now is the time for the top 2, the best books I've ever read. And coming in at number 2 is The Secret Magdalene by Kai Longfellow. In this novel, Kai Longfellow gives us her own version of the life of Jesus Christ, or Yeshu, as he is called in her story. Longfellow has the gift of beautiful language. She makes a realistic rendition of the society at the beginning of our era. Yeshu is a human being, nothing so whimsical and so impractical as a god, and nothing so arbitrary and so transitory as a king, but a great heart standing on the edge of the world, teaching us all to soar by teaching himself. He has an overwhelming need to share his Gnostic insight with all men and women. He is suffused with the need to show others what he has seen, to have others know what it is he knows. By this, he believes their suffering will end, for by this they will see themselves free, and not merely from the yoke of the Romans or the despair of their secret hearts, but from Yahweh and his laws. This Gnostic insight is worded like this: God is not a being outside the self, nor has it gender, nor is it burdened with a desire to find fault or to test or a need to command obedience. God is consciousness, which is all there is. The author doesn't shy away from non-conventional views. For instance, John the Less, one of the disciples, and Mariamna Magdalena, whom we know as Mary Magdalene, are one and the same. This is, and many other things, are made absolutely plausible in the novel. In the Bible, Jesus cures a blind man so that he can see. In Longfellow's version, Yeshu says this: there are some things that cannot be undone, but there is this thing that can be done, and it's greater than eyes that see. I can give him the sight that is within him. This novel had me on the tip of my seat on every page. I read this before I started reading Neale Donald Walsch, but the two are very strongly related. I underlined too much to mention here, just a few. He who presumes to know aught for certain knows nothing, and he who presumes to know nothing stands at the brink of gnosis. In the end, a very sad fact. Men and women will forever make gods of others rather than see the God in themselves. In a book like The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins attacks monotheism in a raw and rather single-minded way. The Sigrid Magdalene is a multi-layered, poetic and wise way to create understanding about the same matter. Hail to this novel and hail to its creator. Then we've come finally to the number one spot. This is the best book I've ever read, and I'll slowly slide it into view. Scalagrig by William Horwood. This book did everything to me and for me. It made me cry, it made me laugh, it made me think, and it made me enjoy language to the fullest. I believe this is the book that has enriched me the most of all the books I've ever read. This novel, with the weird title Scalagrig, was published in 1987 and has an autobiographical character. William Horwood's daughter, Rachel, was born with cerebral palsy. The story features Esther Marquand, who is born in a spastic body. She cannot speak or walk, but she is highly intelligent. She struggles with questions and with the heavy task of fully accepting life as it has been given to her. That is a road that seems almost impassable, and the many impossible sections of such a road are described in this novel. Horwood prepares the reader and himself for the worst at the outset. How far must we continue this journey before we can begin to experience the unimaginable, namely what it must be like to be Esther ourselves? Esther is the creator of the computer game Scalagrig. The first part of this book ends with the beginning of this peculiar game. It is played by Martin, who becomes obsessed with the creator of this game. You are a parent, and your daughter has just been born. The doctor says if she lives, she may never walk, nor talk, nor pick up an object freely. She may, I'm afraid, be blind. She may be subnormal. I'm so sorry. Imagine you have power over her of life or death. You let her live, type L for live. You let her die, type D for die. Martin cannot decide, so he types don't know. That's when Martin starts telling about his search for Esther, whom he finds. She tells him the background of the game. Within the British community of spastic people, the so-called Scalagrig stories are being told. He is the hero who comes to the rescue of disabled people when they are in need. He's the person who without question considers them full human beings. When Esther, during an unsupervised moment, fell out of her wheelchair, it hit her. The Scalagrig is real. They are not made-up stories. With enormous persistence, she devotes herself to demythologizing the Scalagrig. Eventually, she finds the person who started spreading the Scalagrig stories. Spastic Arthur was put away in an institution in 1927. At the age of 7. His attempts to convince his environment that he is intelligent are utterly futile. Horwood describes graphically how disabled people in those days were maltreated in every conceivable way. When Esther finds him, Arthur is 64 years old. He's been locked up for 57 years. I won't reveal here who the Scalagrig is, but I can say this, it is a very satisfying revelation. After her research, all the questions about the Scalagrig have been answered, but Esther still has not found the answers to her own questions. She creates the computer game, which in a way is her ultimate attempt at finding inner peace. An attempt to accept that she will never be able to pick up a spoon that has fallen on the floor, and that she will never be able to make her grief directly understandable to others. After all the searching and sorrow and pain, she has arrived at the last puzzles and anagrams of her game. If the player is able to unravel these final anagrams, he gets to the heart of the game and the book. Life is usually a self-made maze whose walls are fears and prejudice. A maze through which there is no perfect route, whose final stages demand acceptance of weakness, not display of strength. In the end, strength lies in acceptance. Hope is in truth, not fantasy. Peace cannot be in craving, but in the giving up of desire. In more than 700 pages, Horwood lays out a story that is extraordinary. It's a story that, as one of the blurbs at the back of the book claims, would wring tears from a stone. So, that was my top 10 and altogether my top 22 of all-time favorite books. Thank you very much for watching this very long video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.